Okay, so thank you so much everybody for joining us on day 3 of our virtual wellbeing festival. What would a festival virtually be without any technological issues? So thank you so much for being patient and for joining us. Today's session is around trauma-informed care, and it's an introduction to helping people impacted by psychological injury. So my name is Dawn, and just to introduce the session and what it's about. So many people will experience traumatic events in their lives. Sometimes this can have a serious aftermath. These are normal and understandable reactions to abnormal events. So this session will explore some of the impacts of trauma, the principles of trauma-informed care, and how trauma-informed approaches can have potentially therapeutic benefits for those who have been seriously traumatised. So to help me today behind the scenes will be Robert and Anne, and also Louise will be helping with that as well, and probably Owen if we have any more technological issues. So if I can just talk you through a little bit of housekeeping. So in terms of what you can see on your screen at the moment, your cameras and microphones have been disabled, so you can see that in the top left corner. They may be turned on various points depending on how the session runs. And you are also able to use the chat function to add your thoughts, comments, or ask questions. Alternatively, you can choose the raise your hand function if you've got the right device at the appropriate point and come onto camera and ask your question directly. If you haven't got the right device to enable you to see a raise hand function, just pop in the chat box that you'd like to come on camera and ask the question, and then we'll invite you in. So for colleagues also that are hearing impaired, you can turn your live captions on from the 3 dots at the top of the screen, and that's only enabled on computers using MS Teams apps. So unfortunately, it isn't a feature on phones and iPads. And I just want to let everybody know that the session today will be recorded. So before I hand you over, what we'd like to do is a bit of a test from a Slido point of view. So we are going to be using Slido throughout the session. And to enable us to use Slido, what you'll see is a QR code. So if you've got an iPhone or a really up-to-date Samsung, you can just open your camera and put your camera up to the QR code and it will take you straight in. Failing that, Louise will put a link into the chat box for you to be able to go onto Slido and just tell us a little bit about what you're hoping to get out of the session. So whilst you do that, we'll just give you a minute to be able to get on. We will be using Slido, as I say, throughout the session, and then you're just able to keep your device open. And as the questions drop in later on, it will naturally just drop into your phone as well. So I'll give you a minute to answer your questions. Okay, so we've got some coming in. Okay, so far we've got to gain some insight, develop knowledge of trauma-informed support and how you can use it in your role. A couple of understanding the impact and what trauma is, and a few things to take away and learn a little bit about that. How do we fit that in with our healthcare setting? Fantastic. So lots of things about more information, a little bit about impact and a little bit about the effects of trauma. To feel more confident within my role, brilliant. Self-care, wow, brilliant. I think we have got some in the chat box as well coming through. So I'll just read those. So to see how I could use this information into my healthcare role, thank you for that. Okay, brilliant. So what I will do, so I'll allow just a few more seconds for people to add to that. And then what we'll do is just move on and I'll introduce our speakers. Okay, so more about confidence, brilliant. Okay, so what I would like to do now, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to put your thoughts into Slido there. But I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kaj Ruth, Victoria and Tracy, who are going to be taking you through our session. So please enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dawn. So I just want to say hello quickly and say I'm very pleased to be speaking today on a session about trauma-informed care. I'm a clinical psychologist newly joined to Northamptonshire NHS. It's mainly me speaking today, but I am joined by Victoria and Tracy, so they're going to be helping to cover the chat today. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Victoria. As the slide is already implying, I am an assistant psychologist in the complex PTSD service.
And hi, good afternoon. I'm Tracy Ackrell. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've worked in the trust since 2007 and then just newly joined the new complex PTSD service. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll say very little bit about the new service in a minute. But can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. And the next slide. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to start by letting people to know what to expect from today's session. So the main two things that we're covering today are what is trauma-informed care, and to spend a bit of time talking about the potential impacts of traumatic events on health. It's very much an awareness session, an introduction to the topic. I'm very happy for people to have my slides after the event. And I thought I'd just open by saying that trauma-informed care represents a huge shift in understandings about trauma and how we offer care. Whilst I won't be talking about clinical work here today or advising about clinical situations, I am hopeful that we can sort of have an introduction to the area and think about themes which you might recognise in your own work. So really, I'm hoping today sparks some thinking and discussion about where you work. It is a huge area and it's a very exciting and rapidly developing area. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but hopefully it sparks some conversation that will lead to more conversation. Because today's talk does involve discussing trauma, I do want to give a trigger warning that the talk is kind of focusing not in detail, but will be speaking about some traumatic events. And there is an animation that gives an explanation about trauma later on. So totally understand that, you know, if you need to step away, and there are supports which I'll come to in a minute. In terms of today, the key messages really I'd like people to hopefully walk away with are that traumatic experiences are common, that trauma can have a range of impacts on people, that traumatic experiences can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder or complex post-traumatic disorder, but actually it's not the same and it's not inevitable. There are lots of people who've been through trauma who do not develop that diagnosis. And that trauma-informed care is everyone's business, and the provision of trauma-informed care really lines up beautifully with compassionate care. It's ethical and it's helpful, and that trauma-informed organisations look after their staff. So you might want to reflect on what some of the ideas you hear today could mean for your own workplace, what you might want to do, or what you're already doing that's aligned with trauma-informed care principles. Trauma is a public health issue, and I think that's one of the main things that's coming out of trauma-informed kind of thinking, is that actually it's far more common than has previously been recognised. And in recognition of that, we may have experienced trauma ourselves, we may know people who've been traumatised, and we may have worked with people who've been traumatised. So it's very important to kind of think about self-care. I'll say a little bit more about that on the next slide, please. So hopefully I've given you a bit of an introduction about what to expect. In terms of kind of knowing a little bit about me and thinking about well-being, there will be some organisations at the end of the talk, at the end of the session, if you've been personally affected by what you've heard today. I will also in a minute introduce a slide about national organisations. And also I thought I would say a little bit about myself and about the service that's being set up. So as I said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've worked in the NHS since the early 1990s, mainly in adult mental health and in primary care, but mainly in community mental health settings. I've done some inpatient work as well over the course of my career so far. And I've got a special interest in the area of trauma and its impact on people's lives, and particularly how disadvantage and power and inequalities in health impact on people's experiences. So I'm very pleased to be helping to set up a new service across this year for people who've been diagnosed with complex PTSD, and we've got a small team that's growing across the year, which is very exciting. Already Tracy and Victoria and some other colleagues have joined, and we're hoping to have more staff by the end of the year. So we know the experience of trauma is very common, and this is true amongst us as employees as well. And whilst I'm not here to talk about my own personal experience in detail today, I am going to name that I'm also a survivor practitioner. So I've also got my own lived experience of trauma during my childhood. And I'm saying that in the interests of recognising that there are lots of people in the helping professions who may have lived experience, and there's not always a space to talk about that safely. It's my choice to talk about it now, and I think nobody should feel pressured to share things that they're not happy to share. But I'm certainly recognised that there have been times in my career where it was much less safe than it is now to speak out. And given that this is a virtual wellbeing festival, it does feel important for me personally to kind of acknowledge that I do have that lived experience. And hopefully we're widening the space to make it safe for other people to do so too. And I guess in recognition of that kind of, there may be people who will be personally affected for whatever reason during today's talk. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Robert. Just a word about self-care. Look after yourself. You're precious. If you need support, there will be details at the end, and there are other organisations, NHS Helpline, NSPCC, NAPAC, which is the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, the Survivors Trust, Rape Crisis England and the Samaritans, and that's not an exhaustive list. There are other sources of help, and I know that Dawn will be talking about local support at the end of the session. So if you do need to step away, please do. The talk is recorded. You can come back and listen later. Okay, so next, please. So to open, one of the most important ideas in trauma-informed care is this, that there's a fundamental shift happening, that we're moving from thinking about what is wrong with somebody, what's wrong with you, so very symptom focused perhaps, to considering what happened to you. So what's the story, what's happened to somebody underneath those symptoms. So the experience of trauma in people's stories hasn't always been linked or recognised as being connected to their current mental distress. People are not always asked about what's happened to them, or asked in sensitive or compassionate ways. And, you know, as staff, we may feel that we've not been trained to do that, or felt confident to do it. And I can think back to my own training, which is a while ago now, where actually we didn't have conversations about kind of routine inquiry into people's kind of lived experience of trauma. So I recognise that people may not feel confident to explore it. Next. And when we're talking about trauma, I would like to emphasise that traumatic events are perhaps on a continuum. I've heard people talking about little t and big T events. I'm not massively keen on that kind of distinction, because I think actually who gets to decide what feels less or more traumatic. But largely we can think about major life events like relationship breakdowns, job losses, sudden illness, and we may recognise these as a society as things that happen to people which can be very distressing, although perhaps we don't even talk about those things enough as a society. And in terms of traumatic incidents, what we're talking about is things that may be life-changing, include violence, the threat of death, or very intense trauma. So that can include being a direct victim of a traumatic incident or being a witness to a traumatic incident, either directly or indirectly. So hearing about something very traumatic that's happened to a loved one can also be very traumatizing. And those kinds of incidents can threaten somebody's sense of personal integrity, so who we are fundamentally as people, a shattering of our assumptions about a safe world or a just world, and it can impact on our physiological responses, how we react. And I think in real life, these often are overlapping. It's more complicated, so it really depends on the context and the meaning of what's happened. So for instance, you know, somebody might be going through a relationship breakdown, but if that's in the context of domestic abuse, then that could be a very heightened traumatic event. So how prolonged events are, how long they go on for, whether they're repeated, because often, sadly, people experience repeated trauma. If they were interpersonal, so if they were carried out by another person, particularly a person we care about or are intimate with, and the response that we get afterwards, whether we're heard or believed or can tell, there's a safe space to tell into. All of those factors are going to impact on how much trauma affects people. Next, please. So trauma is a little word, but actually it covers a huge breadth of experiences. And traumatic events, again, they're common. I think there's been a research done that says 1 in 3 people report experiencing at least one traumatic event in their life. That's huge numbers. And so part of the shift to trauma-informed care, again, is recognising the scale of trauma in society. So we've talked, trauma can cover single event experiences like being involved in a serious traffic accident, or multiple or repeated trauma. There's much more of a discussion going on now about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, if you've heard that term, such as physical, sexual abuse, neglect, or emotional abuse, and how these can really impact very significantly on people's development and their quality of life. I'm also very interested in the intersections of power and having a marginalised identity. So for instance, somebody who's neurodiverse may find navigating everyday life can be traumatic. Going to the dentist, having medical interventions can be very traumatic. Or they may be exposed to trauma through bullying or social exclusion. There's been much more of a conversation about the impact of racial trauma on people, homophobia and other forms of marginalisation, stigma and social exclusion. There's adult trauma that people might go through, such as domestic abuse, traumatic bereavement, traumatic birth experiences. There's occupational trauma. There's been a big conversation over this last year and a half about the impact of the pandemic on NHS staff. There's been conversations about military trauma, about moral injury, about how one might be compromised personally in terms of core values if you can't provide the kind of care that you want, exhaustion and burnout. People may be traumatised through experiences of forced migration, such as having to move because of climate disaster or natural disaster, trafficking, war, modern day slavery. And again, there is much more of a conversation opening up now, which I think is welcome, about mental health, and much more recognition of the impacts on mental health of the pandemic. And again, there's been discussions about the impact on NHS staff, particularly in ICU, or the experience of patients in ICU, or those suffering with long tail impacts of COVID, and how many people have been impacted by loneliness during the pandemic, as well as grief. So it's a huge breadth of experience that people are potentially faced with, and of course people may experience multiple traumas. Next, please. Thank you. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of focus on was the kind of continuum of reactions that people can experience when they have been traumatised, and that those can be very, very natural reactions. Trauma doesn't automatically lead to PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, but it can do. And you may come across the diagnoses of PTSD and complex PTSD, so I thought it might be helpful to just give some information about those. It's not clear exactly why some people develop PTSD and others don't. We'll have a think about it, some ideas about that later, but it's estimated that, as I said, about 1 in 3 adults have been through something traumatic, at least one traumatic event, and around about 3 to 7% of those people may go on to develop prolonged reactions of post-traumatic stress disorder. There is no one way of reacting to traumatic events. The experience can be highly individualised and highly unique. People may have all kinds of reactions, such as depression, developing psychosis, OCD, eating disorders. So there's not just one way that people might react. So it's very usual when somebody's been through a traumatic event to experience acute stress, linked with shock of going through something major. And often those symptoms will settle down after about a month, but not always. And they can include intrusive memories, experiencing nightmares, the disruption of our natural biological rhythms, like sleeping, feeling like we've got motivation to get up and go out and do stuff, impacting on mood, and this hypervigilance, which often gets talked about, which is basically somebody being on threat mode, watching out for danger. Your red alert, we've all got a red alert or an inbuilt alarm system, and that being really ramped up and very sensitive. If the symptoms go on, so many people will find that they've got disturbance for a period of time. If the symptoms go on, and say usually about a month, then it might be time to reach out for help, because post-traumatic stress disorder might be developing. And again, that's symptoms like hyperarousal, this kind of red alert that's kind of, and sensitivity that people experience. Avoidance, so feeling like you can't go places, generally very frightened, avoiding people and avoiding places you might normally go. And this reliving that, or re-experiencing that people talk about, which is where people are experiencing nightmares or daytime flashbacks or intrusions to the event, and that hasn't settled down. It could be very disruptive to people. And then we're talking about a newly emerging diagnostic category or diagnosis, of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there's some debate about this. Some people say that everything is under the umbrella of PTSD. There is a kind of a debate going on kind of globally about complex post-traumatic disorder as being something separate, where people may be displaying problems with trusting others, relating to people, which if you think about somebody might have been harmed by a caregiver or somebody who's intimate to them and trusted, that's really understandable reaction. People might have very poor self-concept, so particularly where abuse has gone on for a long time or harm's gone on for a long time, and particularly for children, they may grow up feeling that they're a bad person and they're to blame for things. Whatever goes wrong is their responsibility, feel self-disgust or shame, and that can be very intense. And also very significant problems with managing emotions, so very quickly getting triggered into very, very heightened emotion and distress. Next, please. Thanks, Robert. So in terms of kind of thinking about how people react to trauma, I suppose one of the things I'm really trying to emphasize is that, you know, these are normal and understandable reactions to what may be abnormal or out of our usual experience events that have been very distressing. So trauma can impact on our bodies, our brains, our beliefs, and our behaviours. And one of the main things about how we react after trauma is that our brain is really clever. It tries to help us survive. And what it goes into, which you may have heard already, is fight, flight, freeze when we're confronted with something that's really threatening. So those are efforts for your body and your brain to kind of save oneself. And people go into survival mode during trauma, and the video, the animation that you'll see shortly will give a little bit more information about that. And that explosive kind of fight, flight, freeze is meant to get us out. It's a short-term reaction, but sometimes we can't escape traumatic incidents or traumatic events, in which case what can happen is that people go into fright, flag or faint or flop mode and friend mode. So if trauma is inescapable, there will be other ways that may be more about shutting down to try and cope with what's going on. Some of those physiological reactions continue for long periods of time after the trauma's finished, if that trauma is unprocessed. So it's very normal for memory not to be laid down properly and to come back as fragments and very sensory experiences, which are very frightening for people and unbidden. They come uninvited. So prolonged trauma, prolonged stress can unsurprisingly have emotional, physical, psychological and social impacts that we've just been talking about. People might find it really hard to trust. They might feel very ashamed, feel guilty, find it hard to talk. They may stay away from other people. They may behave in ways which are hard to understand, but actually they're all patterns of survival that people are being triggered into to try and keep themselves safe. And again, just to reinforce that traumatic events can lead to post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD, but they might not, and there might be other manifestations of trauma on people. For instance, on physical health, there's now very clear links between trauma and health harming behaviours, as well as physiological responses like high blood pressure, increased risk of health problems. Okay, next. So what I'm going to show you next is a section of animation from Scotland. Scott Scotland's government have put a huge amount of investment, if you can just not play it yet, thank you, Anne, huge amount of investment into trauma-informed care, and they're training their whole workforce, health and social care workforce, around trauma-informed practices. So they've got some amazing resources on their website, and this is one of them. I'm just going to show you a section of it, but it also, somebody's asked a question. What do you mean by friend in your previous slide? Sorry, I should have explained that. Friending is trying to create a relationship with the person who's harming you. So trying to kind of be amenable, be survive through whatever it takes to survive. So kind of doing what person says, and not making any challenges to the behaviour that you're being exposed to, as a way of surviving. And it's impossible to talk about trauma without talking about power. So often people are in very powerless situations at the time they're traumatised. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. So do take a look at the resources if you're particularly interested in trauma-informed care. And I think one of the key messages I'll come back to is that although these are very serious impacts and can be very difficult and very hard and life-threatening at times for people, there is hope for recovery. So I would really want to convey that message out. Anne, would you mind playing the section of video? I think we're going to 3 minutes 28.
With a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later. But in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the 3 parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's a useful resource, and obviously you're welcome to go and look at that video in its full length, and it can be very helpful to kind of have explanations and understandings of what's going on in trauma. And so often when we're working with people, don't understand what's happening. So having that framework of understanding this is your body's alarm, these are natural and understandable reactions, can be very helpful to people. So thank you, Anne. And that brings me to the next slide, which is about window of tolerance. So we've all got a natural window of tolerance. And basically, when we're in that window, we feel able to cope with what's going on around us and react accordingly without kind of going into red alert mode or shutting down. What happens when people have suffered trauma is that they can experience a real shrinking in that window of tolerance. It can be very small, and one of the things we're often trying to do with people in therapy is to try and widen that window again, or sometimes widen it for the first time. So people can experience a really reduced window, and if they are triggered by something in the environment, and the brain is clever, it's very good at detecting patterns, and sometimes it picks up on patterns that we might not even be aware of. So it could be something like the smell of a certain perfume, or a sound, or something that is a taste that's made somebody remember something upsetting without them realising it. They can then be triggered into either a red alert reaction, which is hyper arousal, when people can become very, very emotionally impacted. They might feel anxious, angry, out of control, or overwhelmed, and have gone into that kind of fight or flight mode. Or sometimes the body will pick up on things and people will shut down and go into hypo-arousal. So this is where people might, as a way of coping, become spaced out, zoned out, frozen. And these are not reactions that people choose, they're automatic reactions as survival mechanisms. So again, helping people to understand that can be very useful. And then, you know, often, as I said, we're trying to work with people to help them to stay connected into the here and now and feel grounded in the present. Thank you. And again, reactions to trauma vary. I said a little bit ago that nobody's really sure why some people go on to develop prolonged trauma, but we're at a place where we're starting to learn much more about trauma. And I think in the next few years, we're going to have much better understandings of those factors. But broadly, personal factors, the nature of the experience, and the context or the healing or non-healing environment that we're in are three really important things to think about. Personal factors might be things like temperament. It might be like the social and family support somebody's got around them, which might create shock absorbers, which affect whether somebody goes through a natural recovery or needs additional help. The nature of experience we've touched on already, whether it's repeated, prolonged, multiple trauma. And then the context that we're in is really important, I think, because sometimes people can be harmed and then they can suffer secondary harm because of the reaction they get from people around them. So people sometimes will find that the trauma that they've been through carries great stigma, shame, it might be taboo, and that means that they might not be able to speak out safely and are silenced about what they've been through. Versus, is there a kind of a space where it's safe to talk, where trauma is recognised, where people are able to get access to timely help and resources, justice, or social and societal recognition of trauma, for instance, not being blamed or shamed for what they've been through. And I think that impacts very greatly on people's recovery journeys. Thank you. So this is where trauma-informed care is really coming in a very exciting way, I think. We can do things to be helpful to people who've suffered trauma. We can do that as a society. We can do that as service providers, and we can do it as citizens to help people who've been impacted. So again, talking to you about trauma and its impacts is partly about recognising what it does to people or can do to people, which has historically been under-recognised. Looking at the scale of what it can mean in terms of people's physical and mental health, because impacts can affect whether people get to access health or other services. So for instance, I've worked with people who won't go to the dentist, won't go to the dentist for years, or won't go to seek any health professional advice until they've hit crisis, and even then have struggled, or have had major impacts in terms of addiction to substances or alcohol. Again, all ways of trying to cope with what's happened. So I think there's a recognition now that there's massive social and societal cost and financial cost if people want to talk about funding of services. There's a massive cost to not addressing trauma. And of course, it impacts on individuals, their quality of life, the quality of their family life, and whether they feel part of their local community. And as I said, trauma and power are intertwined. It's impossible to talk about some traumatic experiences without talking about powerlessness and silencing and stigmatisation. And that's a cultural context which it's really important to change. And I think I see the responding to trauma as an extension of safeguarding. We now have conversations about keeping children safe, keeping vulnerable adults safe, keeping vulnerable people safe. And I remember far enough in my career back that those were very new conversations. So I think things are moving on all the time, and this new kind of trauma-informed care is recognising that people who have been traumatised, who have been impacted, as well as prevention of trauma. And I think it's important to recognise that people are people. So we're seeing people who have been traumatised all across our services. And because it's so common, we know that there will be colleagues who've also experienced trauma in their own lives. So there's something about saying, actually, given the scale, we should be looking at adapting and evolving all our services to be able to respond to recognise, healthfully support people who've been traumatised. Next, please. And then the principles of trauma-informed care will line up with a lot of values that people already have, that already might be enshrined within your own organisations, your codes of conduct. They're around creating safety for people, a safe environment, around enabling trust, around offering choices wherever possible, around working together and collaborating. And I think that means across services, but it also means with local organisations, the voluntary sector, local communities, and it also means co-production and really centralising survivor voices, whatever kind of trauma people have been through, really talking to people and kind of helping them to help us to kind of provide better services, which at the end of the day means better decisions and better health outcomes for people. And empowerment. So we talked about power imbalances often being centralised in trauma, and there's something about trying to give people more power, share power, and make it more equal partnership. So it's everybody's business, top to bottom of organisations, sideways, all staff, clinical, non-clinical. I think this is something that is really, really a shared endeavour that we can think about applying to our own workplaces. Thank you. So what does trauma-informed care look like in where you work? So some examples that I'm kind of thinking about at the moment are how we think about trauma. So, for instance, recovery is a process, not an event. Setbacks are normal. Recovery can take time and is highly personal. Sometimes we're working in systems where there's pressure to fix people within certain time limits. Sometimes that's about resources, not about client need. And it may not be matched to the level of injury somebody's actually suffered. People might need to come in and out of our services over time, sometimes across the lifespan, and that's okay, and it's natural. So I think there's something about how we think about recovery that takes the pressure off, depressurises. Therapeutic versus therapy. Sometimes people will hear trauma and think you must go and get therapy now. And actually not everybody is ready, not everybody wants, and not everybody needs formal therapy. There's a lot that we can do as services to make people feel safer and help to explain what they're going through, work with them to come back into their zone of tolerance. Hope, meaningful activity, healthy social relationships can have huge healing value and can help people to come into their zone of tolerance, feel attuned, feel soothed and understood. We could think about obviously what we do, what we offer. We might want to have some conversations about, you know, what does that feel like if we offer you intervention in this way, and also how it's offered. So paying all attentions to things like coming into the service, being welcomed in, going out of the service, what happens when people go across services, what might be happening that could make people inadvertently feel less safe and more re-triggered into previous trauma. How are letters phrased? How do we train our staff to talk about trauma? What are the spaces like that we invite people into to do therapy or other therapeutic interventions? What does that feel like? HR staff, thinking about trauma-informed policies for staff who've got lived experience or have a trauma that they experienced during work. So it's everywhere that we could think about it. So it's aiming to reduce the harms in systems as well, not having people telling their stories over and over, which is a theme that comes up a lot. Being sensitively asked about trauma, being appropriately signposted on. Sometimes pathways aren't always very clear. We could do work to kind of make that clearer for people and less difficult to navigate. It builds on better understandings of how trauma impacts on people's lives so that we recognise what people are going through and we can respond in ways that don't unintentionally amplify distress. And it looks after its staff. You know, trauma-informed care means looking after staff with lived experiences, recognising the kinds of emotional labour that go on in the work that we do. We give of ourselves in our jobs. Many of us will be here for vocational reasons, and so it's important to look after ourselves and look after each other. And we may be vicariously traumatised in the work that we do, and also recognising that and building in support is incredibly helpful. And then everybody working together on preventing trauma and helping to respond to trauma. So again, you know, I'm very passionate about co-production and survivor voices as being central, because it will lead to better decisions and more appropriate care, and that can only be to the good. Next, please. So this next video is again a short bit of video from the Scottish group. Again, it's a longer video, please do look at it. I've taken it from 3 minutes 30 seconds in, and we'll just let it run to near the end. And it's again the idea of the system being part of the therapeutic offer. And the point is this: small and positive things can have a big positive impact. We can do a lot to help clients and patients widen their zone of tolerance and to feel safer receiving care. Thank you, Anne. I'm not sure I've got sound. Anyone picking up any sound? Sorry, Anne.
No, I can't hear any sound.
Okay.
Have you got the sound included on that share, Anne?
I think I had, but I'll just go back to the beginning and do it again.
The impact of trauma. The impact
Perfect.
of the body's response to stress. There's childhood experiences like these affect
Hear
our
it
body's
now?
response to
Yeah.
stress, affecting our physical health as well as our mental health. The impact of trauma can also make it harder for us to learn and to realise our full potential.
One of the most worrying things about the experience of trauma is that it can make us avoid people and places, even if they are there to help, like doctors, teachers, social workers, carers, colleges,
councils, community centres, employers, advisors, because most trauma experiences happen in relationships with other people. We can find it difficult to trust people or feel safe. And sometimes the way we react to help ourselves feel safe pushes people away and makes it even harder to get the help we need.
It's like our brains learn survival tricks to get us through the trauma at the time, like priming us for danger.
Making us run away.
shutting down when we feel upset.
It might look like we have a short fuse, like we're unfriendly, or we're just a bit absent.
Anything, however small, that reminds us of that trauma can set off our own unique trauma response to protect ourselves, making us avoid the people and places that we need the most, like you. But there are things you can do to help me trust you enough so I feel safe and I don't shut down or avoid you. You can offer me a different relationship that doesn't remind me of the one I had when I was a kid. One where I feel safe, I feel empowered, and I have choice and control over what happens to me. One where we work together and I can trust you. This is called being trauma-informed in the way you work.
Being trauma-informed means thinking about what will make me feel safe. It might mean offering me choice over the sex of the person offering me care or support, especially if it
That stopped for
else
me.
instead. Do you have any preferences about who comes instead?
Well, I'd feel more comfortable with someone I've met before. Most importantly, I'd like a woman.
Well, how about June? She's worked with us for 3 years. If there's anything you'd like her to do that Heather normally does, just ask.
Trauma-informed means empowering me to have control and take an active role in what happens to me.
We know some people don't like coming to the dentist, so is there anything that you're worried about or scared of? I can tell you each step I'm doing, so there are no surprises if you'd like. If you need me to stop, how will you tell me?
Trauma-informed means helping me to trust you by being clear about what will happen, doing what you say you will do when you said you would do it.
Unfortunately, our advisors are running about 30 minutes late. I'm so sorry about that. Are you able to stay, or can we make another appointment for you?
Many of us at work will have had our own experiences of trauma in our own lives, or we might witness or hear about it in the course of our work. So the same principles apply to all of us. We all need to take care of ourselves by making sure we're safe and connected to the people and activities that matter to us. Can you think of anyone you've met or worked with recently that a trauma-informed approach would have made a difference to? Are there any trauma-informed changes you might make that could make a difference?
So if you offer me safety and choice, if you collaborate with me and empower me and help me trust you, then you will help me work with you. Even if I only meet you once, even briefly, you can give me a different kind of relationship. One where I feel valued and valuable, connected and safe.
And when that happens over and over again with everyone that I meet, I can learn that it's safe to make connections with people.
It is those connections that we all need to access life's chances and reach our full potential.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. I've realised I have gone on longer than I thought I was going to, so I'm really sorry about that. My final slide is just saying that there's hope for recovery, and I think there's something incredibly hopeful about the video that we've just seen. You know, communications, adaptations. It gives some lovely examples of small things which can cumulatively make a big difference. I'm not sure if my final slide has gone, but I just wanted to say, you know, cultural change can help people to recover, and that cultural change is around our beliefs, our attitudes and our safe spaces. And we can think about how we are offering services to make a difference. And finally, one of the things that's so potentially harmful is shame-based silence, and we really need to move away, widen the space, and make it safe to help people get care, compassion and support and the help that they need, and which is their right. My screen has gone very peculiar, so I don't know whether you can still hear me. I hope you can. But thank you very much for listening. We did have, thank you, we did have some questions that we were going to ask, but I'm also very conscious of the time. So if you did need to leave at past, please, I understand if you need to go. If you are able to stay a few more minutes, then I think Dawn wants to give you some messages at the end of the session. I do have some questions that I was hoping to ask you over Slido. Just wanted some feedback from you really about any common themes that you might notice in service experience for people who are traumatised. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if Slido's working. Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, that's a very common theme. School non-attenders, yeah. Thank you. People having to repeat their stories, a really common one, yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next Slido. If you've got any comments that you wanted to add, please add them to the chat. Oh, lots coming through now. What do you think the service gaps are for people who are traumatised? And again, if you don't get a chance to answer in Slido, please, or you haven't got Slido, please put in the chat. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. More specialised knowledge, yeah. Parents of children with disabilities, yeah. Okay. Helping make sense of what they've encountered. Okay. So that educational sort of piece, some of the messages and awareness raising. Okay, thank you. And because of time, I'm so sorry, I'm going to move on to the final question, which is in recognition that we might need more training. Well, we're very likely to need more training around. It's such a big area. What training topics might you find helpful? And again, if you can't answer in Slido and you were able to leave comments in the chat, we'd be very grateful for your feedback. Okay, mental health awareness, applying the model in practice and ongoing supervision. How to identify between different conditions, which may include trauma. Okay, thank you. They're all really helpful comments. And again, you know, please do feel free to give us your feedback in the general feedback form as well. So I'm just going to say thank you. I'm not sure that there is enough time to pick up questions, and I'm not sure, Dawn, are you around? I'm just going to say thank you. That's the main part of my talk over. And just wanted to thank the team, Tracy, Victoria, Dawn, Anne, Louise, Owen, Robert, and anybody else I've not mentioned. I've really valued having some space to talk to you all. I don't know that there's, because we've gone over 4:30, whether there's any space for questions, or maybe it's better to
if anybody wants to post any questions or comments in, so if I, for example, if I share the screen, if anyone has got any questions or comments for Kaj, then please feel free to pop them in the chat box, and we can then forward them on and send you the response, which may be an option for us as well. So please feel free to do that. But Kaj, thank you so much for an amazing session, a really important subject matter. And when you get a chance to look through the chat box, you'll see that that's reflected in there as well. So thank you so much. So I know that lots of people are probably having to shoot off now, but for those of you that are still here, just want to let you know that Louise is going to be popping a feedback link into the chat box in a moment. Feedback is a gift. It helps us to learn and shape future events around what you are looking for. So please leave your feedback by completing a very short survey. Use the link in the chat or the QR code on screen with your phone, a little bit like you did with Slido, just to take you through to that survey, and share your thoughts on the session. All feedback entries get entered into a prize draw to win a Virtual Wellbeing Festival 2021 goodie bag with some festival goodies. Some of the bags will also have a book from one of our keynotes. So as you can see, you've got to be in it to win it. This is just the plan of the whole week. So many fantastic sessions happening across the week. Please, if you're able to, get logged on. Some of them are pre-recorded, so you'll be able to look back on those, but we've got plenty more coming up as well. In fact, I think there's a meditation session just about to happen. I feel like saying on a different channel, but it's about to happen as well. So check all of those out as well. There are some challenges. So as well as all the sessions that are available, we've got 3 different challenges happening. So we've got a stair climbing challenge, just to see how you can challenge yourself by setting a target to climb stairs, photography challenges, getting outside and taking pictures, and sharing those on social media with the hashtag VWBF2021. And we have also got a bit of a music challenge as well. So it's just a call to action for us to create an NHCP wellbeing playlist. So what music makes you feel better? Share your thoughts, and we'll compile a playlist to include everybody's choices. And finally, we have created a digital resource pack, which is being shared by comms colleagues and is also available to download from the website. So check that out as well. And please get social, so you can see links for Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. So share your thoughts, learnings and experiences from the festival. Please tag our NHCP and your own organisations in those as well. The hashtag is Northants Wellbeing, and the hashtag for the photography challenge, as I've just said, is hashtag VWBF 2021. So let's get Northants Wellbeing trending on Twitter like we did last year. And then finally, I know that Kaj mentioned this a little bit earlier on in our session, but if you've been affected by the information or experiences during this session, or indeed any other sessions that we've run over the week, or in general if you need some extra support, you can see we've got Stronger Together, so providing that wellbeing support to health and social care colleagues across Northamptonshire. We've got a Changing Minds IAPT, so that's for talking therapies to support stress, anxiety and depression. And then we've got our mental health number, so it's a mental health crisis line and website for more information. So finally, as I've said many a time, I want to thank everybody for joining us. It's really valuable to us that you take the time out of your day to log on to these calls, and I just want to thank you all, and thanks to everybody behind the scenes, and especially to Kaj today for your amazing session. So thank you everybody, and have an amazing day.
Thank you. Go gently everyone. Take care.